And so he's talking about feeling the joy of God. And we have this when we come to the next part of the verse, which says, be like-minded. Right? And if we go back up and we look at verses in chapter 1 and we look at verses 27 and 28, we see that we see this again, being steadfast in one spirit, striving together in one mind for the faith of the gospel. Now he's sitting there saying, be like-minded, having the same love, being of one accord and of one mind. So are you seeing a theme here between the end of chapter 1 and the beginning of chapter 2? It's unity, right? And within our church, we have a lot of talk today about unity. Within the Seventh-day Adventist Church, we have a lot of this conversation about it. And we're trying to figure out how to be unified, but we can't really figure it out because we're trying to make rules about it, and we're having discussions, and we're all coming together and we're fighting up against each other. And this is something that's been happening for a long time, but in the more recent history of our church, we have been divided over various different topics, whether it be worship, whether it be dress, whether it be women's ordination, whether it be anything like that. We're always divided, and what happens is, instead of coming together in the mission of Christ, we pick each other apart by the things that we disagree on, instead of focusing on the things that we should be agreeing on. And so friendly territory becomes hostile territory because we're scared of each other, because we become where we're always at odds with each other. Interestingly enough, I was at a conference this week down in Pigeon Forge for our ministers' meetings, and the topic of the conference was church revitalization. And so we had a speaker who came in who is one of the experts within the church of church growth, and has 3 different times taken a congregation of anywhere between 15 to 20 and grew the congregation to, the smallest church grew to 600, the largest grew to almost 1,200. From a very small congregation to help them, he helped turn around churches. And he actually specifically went to a church and went to the conference and said, we want you to come back and pastor. And they said, well, what church do you want? It's like, well, I want a church that's dying. He's like, well, we got lots of those. And depending on which statistics you look in North America, the church, anywhere between 70 to all the way up to 90% are considered declining. Within the Adventist church, it's 67% of our churches in North America are declining according to the actual statistics. We're not doing very good. Last year, the Adventist church in North America grew 1.0003%. And that includes first-generation immigrants and Hispanic churches, which means the typical Anglo church is not growing. Have you ever noticed when we sit there, we often talk about the church in the words, and we use the book of Revelation, and we talk about this idea of remnant. And we always, when we look at the remnant, a remnant is something that looks like the beginning. And we often pride ourselves on this idea of remnant, and it's a very biblical idea, but we always miss one of the identifying factors of remnant. If we look at the first century church, it was a church that was growing. And we're not. We have to take a hard look at ourselves and understand that the Christian church, and I'm not talking about just within the Adventist background, within our own tradition, our own tribe, the Christian church in North America is not thriving and growing. But the Bible says, if Christ be lifted up, I draw all men unto myself. So there's something that's getting in the way, and that thing that I'm proposing to you this morning that's getting in the way is we're not unified in enemy territory with having a singularity of mission. And we're going to be looking at that second part, is even within friendly territory, we make fights where there doesn't need to be fights. So Bill McClin, the guy who we're talking about here, took a church and said, I want to take a church tonight. I want to see if I can help turn this around. Because it needs to be more than just theory. It needs to be practical. And he was able to help this church turn around. And the thing was, this church was a church that used to be a large church that had dwindled down and dwindled down and dwindled down. And what he says was the turning point was when he got the church focused back on the mission of what it should be doing. And he said, well, we're going to do an evangelism series in 3 months. And the church's like, well, nope, we can't do that. We don't have the money. We're fighting with each other about everything. We can't agree on the color of the carpet. These things were some serious things, right? We're not unified. We can't do this until we get our act together. And he says, well, what better way of getting our act together than knowing that we're going to be bringing visitors into our house? Have you ever invited somebody to your house and been like, well, man, I got people coming over. I need to clean my house. But if you don't have anybody coming over, you're like, well, I mean, I can live here. It's not that bad. I mean, it's just plaster falling off the ceiling. I can get to that eventually. But if you have somebody coming over, I know anytime that we have people coming over to my house, My wife gets frantic and starts cleaning everything. I'm sitting there looking around like, this house looks pretty good to me. It looks pretty clean. Well, she frantically goes on and starts cleaning everything because she wants to make sure the house is presentable for guests. And I try to remind her, honey, people understand we have kids, we live here. You know, if they walk into our house and it looks like it's a model in a showroom, they'll be like, do you even live here? But the truth is, when we invite people into our home, we do some cleaning. And the focus becomes not on what is he wearing or what is she wearing, what is he doing, what is she doing. The focus becomes on what are we doing to reach people with the gospel of Jesus Christ. Because if that's not our focus, then what are we here for? We're just a country club. And 10% of your income is more than the dues of a country club. We're here with the purpose of reaching people with the gospel. And too much time is spent with the church arguing about the small things and not focusing on the one thing. A phrase that's used over and over in the end of Philippians, in the beginning of Philippians chapter 1 and the beginning of Philippians chapter 2. Being of the same love, this is the agape love that's used here. Being of one accord, being within the same unity. Fulfill my joy, being like-minded, having the same love, being in one accord, and of one mind. Let nothing be done in selfish ambition. Now again, this is political language, and basically the language that's being used here, and the way this phrase is being used, because this phrase is not used in the New Testament very often, and so we have to go outside the New Testament to understand what this phrase would maybe mean. And during that time frame, when writers would use this phrase, it was often talking about don't try to put yourself above somebody else and make yourself look better than somebody else to get ahead. I had a buddy of mine when I was in the military that both of us had some new guys came in, and part of the military procedures and whatnot is you train the soldiers that are below you to be able to promote themselves and to do well. You know, leadership is not how well you lead, but how well the people under you come up, right? And so the true act of a leader is somebody, if you have somebody that you've trained and taught and whatnot, they surpass you. That's not a bad thing. That's a good thing when we talk about leadership, when we talk about teaching and whatnot, when they surpass you. And so he had this soldier that he was training up, and then when the soldier got ready to put in his application to go on to a higher school, to get a higher pay grade and all these things, he basically in his application talked about how much better he was than his sergeant. And he put his sergeant down to make himself look good and end up getting the position, and is now, even to this day, I think he's a W4 in the military, which is one of the highest ranks you can get as a warrant officer. 5 is the highest you can get. I think he's a 4 now. He went on to go to helicopter school. He's a helicopter pilot. I think he can even fly fixed wing. I mean, he's gone on to do some great things, but he started by downing somebody else to be able to get there. That's not the way that we try to get ahead. Now, can you do it? Yes. We often talk about within the church, and I'm going to go off on just a little side tangent here, and forgive me for this, but we often talk about the church, about worldliness creeping into the church, that we don't want the things of this world to creep into the church. And when we often use this language, we almost universally mean music or dress or style or any of this kind of things. But if you go through and you do a word study on worldliness in Scripture, none of that's mentioned. Cultural norms are not mentioned. Things that are of that day are not mentioned. It's talking about attitudes and the way that you treat people. And oftentimes we will sit there and we will fight to the death to make sure that worldliness or the appearance of worldliness doesn't come into our church. But our hearts are as worldly as can be because we care only about ourselves and our selfish ambition and what can I get out of church versus what can I do for somebody else. Simply put, church is not for us. It's for the people that are not here yet. It's not for the saints, but it's for the sinners that need to come in. And sometimes when you deal with sinners, things get messy. I had a friend of mine that went to the conference, asked him to go into the church and to do an evangelism series and help the church grow because the church was stagnant. It had like 10 or 12 members and had stayed that way for a long time. And they wanted to bring some new life, some new blood into this. And so he starts working with this church and he starts talking to them. And they're so absolutely against bringing anybody new into the church. They're against evangelism, and he couldn't figure out why. And then the head elder talked to him and sat him down and was like, you know, we really appreciate what you're trying to do here and the zeal that you have and all for God, but we don't want to bring anybody else in. We're already perfect. We don't want to bring in some more mess to mess us up. This is a true story that happened within the last 10 years within the Adventist church. And we laugh about that because that sounds funny, but that's mentality sometimes that we have, that we don't want to bring outside people in because they may corrupt us. That's not church. That's a club. And it's a club that's not even saying, hey, let's bring some people in here. That's not what church is about. Church is about getting down and getting messy. And it might mean that we might be uncomfortable sometimes. But what Paul's talking about here, he continues on to sit there and say, nothing be done through selfish ambition, conceit, but in lowliness of mind, let each esteem others better than himself. We have let worldliness creep into the church because it's all about me and not about the person sitting next to me. I'm going to help you. I'm going to adjust everybody's identify friends and foe in here. We're going to look at adjusting our IFF this morning. Look around you. If you look at any person that's sitting in here, go ahead and identify them as friend. Because if they're sitting in here, they're not your foe. I want you to get out and I want you to go to the worst part of town and I want you to sit there and I want you to look at the people that are shooting up, taking pills, drinking, whatever the case may be, and look at them and understand that your identify friendly or foe should automatically see them as friendly, not foe. Even that boss that you don't like that is always on your case and just grilling you and grilling you and grilling you and it's unfair and it's unright, that person's friend, not foe. And if you're a boss here, I hope none of your employees think that of you. No matter who you come in contact with, they're friendly, they're not a foe. The foe is Satan and his angels. We have to stop attacking one another within the church. That does not bring unity within our church. What brings unity is when we are in hostile territory, we are fighting against the devil, and we have a mission of reaching people with the gospel of Jesus Christ. When we're in the church, we're so focused on that mission of going into a hostile environment, we don't have time to hang out in the friendly environment because we're always in the hostile environment. But when we do have to come back onto the base, that we don't sit there and focus on each other and see an enemy in somebody who's not an enemy. Our world has changed in the past 10 years. I'm a pretty young man. I'm 35 years old. In the past 10 years, since getting out of the military, I can see a major change in the way the world is. People will disagree about everything. There was a thing that went around the internet last year. It said, this potato offends me. Because it's the sensitive nature of which we live, because everybody is offended by everything. And people will automatically interpret things through their own lens, and they'll automatically demonize somebody on the other side without knowing all the information. No matter what the situation is, whether it be a police shooting, whether it be somebody breaking and entering, whatever the case may be, we always automatically go, even if the situation looks bad, and maybe, hey, we need to look at this. We always assume the worst. We never ask for more information, and we make a decision and judgment based on our own bias and what works best for us and what proves our purpose versus then looking at all the information. If we are going to survive in this war, and the Bible says that we are at war, we have to be on the mission of Jesus Christ first and foremost. And we have to stop seeing each other as enemies. Because if you're going to survive in friendly territory, there's not an enemy in this room. Back several years ago, I think it was 2005, 2006, I don't remember the exact dates. You heard about the Army major in Texas that went onto the base and started shooting. He was U.S. military, and he ended up starting shooting, killing dozens of people, injuring even more. My buddy was there in the clinic, getting seen that very day when that guy opened up fire. And he sits there and he tells me the terror. It's like he has been on 4 deployments to Afghanistan, to Iraq. He has been over there. He has seen things that would make a normal person shudder, and tremendous amounts of PTSD. And he said he's never been more scared in his entire life until he was at home in a place that he thought was a friendly place, and somebody opened fire and started attacking. There's nothing scarier than that. And he sits there and he calls me. I call him actually, because when I hear about what happened and where it happened, I knew that that's where he was stationed at. I wanted to make sure that he was okay because they hadn't released the names of those who had been killed and injured yet. And I called and I didn't get an answer, and I called and I didn't get an answer, and I'm sitting there getting scared because I've lost friends in combat before. I've lost friends in Iraq, and I've lost friends in Afghanistan. And you know, you find out months later who it all is. But you know, this is guys in the States. I'm sitting there going, like, oh my goodness, what's going on? And he sits there and tells me, he's like, man, Tom, I've never been so more scared in my life. This guy was like my little brother. I adopted him when I was in Korea and kind of as my little brother, and I always helped look after this guy. The church doesn't need to be a scary place. And when we stop looking at each other, whether it be in this congregation or another congregation, wherever the case may be, and folks, let me go ahead and sit there and say, people in other congregations aren't the enemy either. People of other faith backgrounds are not the enemy either. People of other belief systems are not the enemy either. So Wednesday, before we came back home, Dr. David Smith, the president of Southern Adventist University, the new president of Southern Adventist, well, I guess he's been there for 3 years. He's not quite so new anymore. I still see Gordon Beats, and when I call Southern, I still think of that, you know, nestled in the foothills of the Smokies and that just deep resonating voice. But Dr. David Smith came to our pastor's meeting to share something that's been going on at Southern Adventist University. And people are starting to talk really badly about Southern, that all these bad things are kind of coming into it. And they're not asking, they're not seeing all these things in. And he starts off by sitting there telling us a bunch of stories of people who have just, their lives have been changed. How they have changed from various backgrounds. He tells us 2 or 3 Chinese students who have come from China here to study, to learn how to share the gospel, to go back into their countries where people are persecuted for sharing the gospel. We're not persecuted for sharing the gospel. We're not tolerated here as much anymore as we were maybe 10 years ago, but we're not really persecuted here in the United States yet. Where they're being persecuted and they're going back in there. And he goes off and he tells story after story, and he sits there and says, you know, there's this thing that's going around in some of the more conservative circles of news outlets within the church. And by the way, most of the news outlets in the church are sometimes just as bad as the ones in the outside of the political arenas. And they're tearing down Southern and saying that this is not a school you should send your kids to if you want them to learn about Jesus. And they started a new position. They're looking to hire a new position at Southern to learn how to include people of different backgrounds, both religiously, both socially, from everything from color to sexual orientation. And they're trying to figure out how to minister to people. And people are coming back and getting mad. It's like, we don't want these type of people in our schools. They're going to corrupt our children. And people are nodding and getting on there. Something, of course, we don't want our children corrupted. We've completely lost sight of what Adventist education is and what church is. Because the people that have those mentalities are the very people that we want there to hear about Jesus day in and day out. You know, Dennis often gets up here and says one of our greatest mission opportunities is our school, and I believe it's correct. We want to reach people with the gospel of Jesus Christ, and the people who need Jesus Christ are the people who are different than us. Side note, people, we need Jesus just as much as they do, and we can't lose sight of that. So the way that we survive in friendly territory is we stop seeing each other as the enemy, and we go into enemy territory and we start fighting for the gospel, fighting for those that are less fortunate for us, for those that are disadvantaged. We start looking at people as people, regardless of what the color of their skin is, regardless if they're part of the LGBT community or not. We start looking at people as people that Jesus died for. That doesn't mean we compromise our beliefs. It doesn't mean that we change the gospel. The gospel is what changes us. I get passionate about this because I've seen too many people leave the church because of being hurt by the church. And I know that I wouldn't be in the church if I didn't have a really hard head. When I first went to Southern Adventist University, I was a theistic evolutionist, which basically means that I believe that evolution was the primary way that God created the earth, and that He used this, and I won't go into all the things that I believe about, but that's the basic idea that God started everything in the Big Bang, and then everything else went its own way. So I went to Southern believing this. I went to Southern believing an anti-Trinitarian message. I believed that Jesus was a created being, and I believed that the Holy Spirit wasn't a person, that there was only God, right? I believe that